like me, you're looking forward to our next guest for this year's keynote address. And as a reminder, there will be an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the keynote address by using the chat feature in this session. Following this year's Ahmed, we invite you to complete a post-event feedback form to share your experience of this day's two-day virtual event. The feedback form will be sent to you via email after the two-day event, so please be on the lookout for that. Your feedback is important to us and will assist us in planning next year's event. Once you complete the feedback form, you will have access to the link to the Certificate of Participation, which you can fill out and print for your records. Your attendance at Ahmed, including this year's keynote address, can count towards the completion of your Continuing Competence Program, also known as CCP. And finally, I would also like to remind you to connect with us on social media, including Twitter and Instagram, over the next 2 days. Be sure to include the hashtag Ahmed2021. I now invite Council President Mukesh Kalasar to introduce our keynote speaker for Ahmed 2021.
Thank you, Dinita. First, let me apologize for the background noise that you probably are hearing. The City of Toronto are doing some construction work on the street right in front of the college office, so it might get loud. But I'm very fortunate and optimistic that our keynote address speaker will be able to handle that, because I know that the ones who know him, he's very boisterous and he'll be able to address that. It is now my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Keith Adamson. Keith Adamson, who is currently an assistant professor teaching stream at the Factor Inwentash Faculty of Social Work, University of Toronto. Prior to that, Keith was the senior director, collaborative practice at Holland Bloorview Kids Rehabilitation Hospital. Keith has more than 20 years of experience in clinical, senior management, and professional practice leadership roles. He is frequently consulted on issues of anti-Black racism and crisis de-escalation. During his keynote address, Keith will address how Black people as a racial group continue to struggle in Canada despite the Canadian society's promise of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging for all. The keynote address will focus on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as a sequential development framework, with each phase containing development challenges that, if successfully negotiated, can influence full participation for Black Canadians in the Canadian society. Implications for social work and social work practice will also be discussed. Please welcome me in welcoming Dr. Keith Adamson.
Thank you, Mr. President. And hello, everyone. I will not be deterred by the City of Toronto. This message will be given. So thank you for that introduction, Mr. President, and thank you for the college's invitation to have this really important conversation. So hello, everyone. Welcome to The Elusive Dream, Anti-Black Racism, and the Search for Belonging in Canada.
I love unfinished things, the bookmark set between closed pages, the field that waits for seed. Canada is a place like that, a history incomplete, a traveler turning around and wondering at the distance gone, the distance yet to go. What was there, Canada? What is ever there on a country's road but times when we were glorious and times of things no one should have done? Our anthem understands words of pride with notes of mourning and the music of resolve to finish and turn towards the road ahead. Here is a place to say, we go on, not as before, and so keep faith with the best of what we are. O Canada, it is a complex love that keeps us together, and all the more true love for that.
You just heard the national anthem of Canada. I thought it was important to open with the national anthem because a national anthem is generally said to be a patriotic musical composition that evokes and, eulogizes the history, traditions, and struggles of its people. Since the killing of George Floyd last year, the struggles of Black people in Canada and around the world appear to be a surprise to others outside of the Black community. And people outside of the Black community appeared not to be aware of the pervasive nature of the struggles of Black people in Canadian society, as well as the deleterious effects that these struggles were having within Black communities and on Black lives. A 2019 survey done before George Floyd's death showed that nearly half of Canadians believed discrimination against Black people was no longer a problem, even as 83% of Black people in Canada say they're treated unfairly at least some of the time. I'm sure about half of Canadians got a rude awakening last year in June. The difficulty, I think, in understanding the struggles of the Black community in Canada reside in what I think is the result of a tremendous Canadian marketing machine. Canada has always touted and sold itself as an inclusive and welcoming space, touting a history of being a refuge for American slaves, as well as bragging about the adoption of multiculturalism in 1971, where Canada was the first country in the world to adopt multiculturalism as an official policy. And the Canadian Multiculturalism Act affirmed the government's policy that every Canadian receive equal treatment, which respects and celebrates diversity. Furthermore, we have the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which suggests that every individual is equal before the law, under the law, and has the right to the equal protection and equal benefit of the law without discrimination. And in particular, without discrimination based on race, national or ethnic origin, or color. Now, while laws like the Multiculturalism Act and the Charter of Rights and Freedoms have created a national narrative of an equitable and accepting society, Black people as a community, given their experience of inequitable treatment or non-acceptance in some spaces within Canadian society, may wonder when the promises of such Canadian laws will come to flourish and materialize in their own lives. Leslie Wu, in a Globe and Mail article in February of 2021, stated that many Canadians believe that our country is a model of inclusion, at least compared to our neighbors to the south, which may not be the best comparison, but that's the comparison. But the sad truth is that while we've turned the page to 2021, we still have a long way to go towards achieving equity for the Black population in Canada. And she goes on to say that we know Black Canadians have been living with relentless inequality for decades. But it has taken painful events, such as the killing of a Black man across the border and a COVID-19 pandemic, which has, created even greater economic and social inequality, to move people to think differently about racism. The awareness of just how big a problem anti-Black racism is, has become quite evident in the academic and mainstream literature since the pandemic, since George Floyd's death, to the point where some have suggested that last spring we were really faced with two pandemics, COVID-19 and anti-Black racism. So when I entitled the presentation, "The Elusive Dream, Anti-Black Racism and the Search for Belonging," all I wanted to say was that the right to full and meaningful participation and the benefits of participation in Canadian society for the Black community may be enshrined in law, on paper, but historically and practically, the promise that those papers hold, the societal contracts, seem to dodge and elude Black people in Canada. And it's not for lack of them, us, trying. So the presentation today will argue that Canada has done an excellent job in diversifying its population. It has. Canada is one of the most racially diverse countries in the world. Canada has diversity. Check. However, with respect to anti-Black racism in particular, I question how far Black people have penetrated Canadian institutions and organizations. I question whether Canada has an equitable culture. I question whether Canada has an inclusive culture. Though Black people are here in Canada and happy to be here because Canada is a beautiful place. There are beautiful things about Canada. There are beautiful aspects to Canada. That video, the first video that I opened with, you saw that beauty. But then there are times where we must question the times, the places, and the spaces when we are made to feel like we do not belong. So I guess that's the dream. That's the dream, to feel like we belong. I think that when you think about dreaming means possibility. Dreaming means possibility. And so maybe after our conversation today, we can consider as a possibility a new roadmap for Canada, where equity and inclusion leads to a renewed sense of belonging for Black people. I mean, I want that for everyone, but today we're going to just talk about Black people. Before we go on, I'd like to make a special dedication. I'd like to dedicate this presentation in honor of the 4 Muslim family members killed in a deadly vehicle attack in London, Ontario on June 6, 2021. These lives were prematurely taken because of hatred in the heart of one of our communities. It is chilling to think that that family was promised a life free from discrimination based on race and religion through all of the social conventions and contracts that we have with Canadian society. And yet, it did not hold true for them. And still, their relatives draped their loved ones in the Canadian flag. A defiant message that says, we belong here too. So today, I feel an even greater sense. We should feel a greater sense of responsibility to engage ourselves. I want to engage you as social workers and social service workers in a conversation about race and racism and a sense of belonging. To understand anti-Black racism, we need to understand the foundation of anti-Black racism in Canada. In a report by the Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion in 2018, and in a report by Deloitte on anti-Black racism in the workplace in 2021, it was stated that many Canadians struggle with making the link between history and contemporary society as it relates to anti-Black racism and discrimination. Understanding Canadian history allows us to recognize why systemic barriers persist and remain particularly stark for Black Canadians. Historical ignorance sometimes permits us not to redress what we cannot see and helps to obscure root causes. What you do not see on this slide are any images speaking to the historical enslavement of Black people for over 200 years in Canada. A past that shared a similar degree of brutality as in the United States that included beatings, lynchings, and rapes. In 1834, slavery was abolished in Canada. We need to know that. Now, once emancipated, and I emancipated in huge quotation marks, Black people were still subjected to racial injustice and discrimination through policy decisions, reinforcement of economic disadvantages, and marginalization. What you do see in the slide is a brief overview of the important historical events that painted the conditions that characterize Canada's past. The picture on the top left is about the struggle of Black railway porters. From the inception of the railroad sleeping cars in 1867, Black porters became a North American tradition. You could say they were like a fad. Portering in Canada became an occupation that was synonymous with Black men. And this trend continued until 1950 and a little beyond. It's written that porters were the lowest paid group of all employees, working very, very, very long hours with very little rest. In fact, regardless of their education, the majority of Black men in Canada, in Canadian cities, were railway porters. It wasn't until 1955 that 3 Black men were hired as conductors on a trial basis because the railway company was getting pressure from the Federal Department of Labor. Those Black porters there, the porters fought like hell to form a union. And when I say fought like hell to form a union, they fought. They had to fight to get a union. And then they fought relentlessly for Black porter rights once they got the union. The picture to the bottom left refers to Sir George Williams' affair, which is the current site of Concordia University in Montreal. So at one time, it was called Sir George Williams. And then they changed the name to Concordia a couple years after. In the spring of 1968, 6 Caribbean students at Sir George Williams University filed a complaint that one of their professors, the professor's name was Perry Anderson, practiced racial discrimination in his courses by giving failing marks to all his Black students, regardless of the quality of their work. They all failed. The university, so they complained, the university formed a committee that examined the complaint and then rejected it on the 29th of January, 1969. Shortly after that decision, over 200 students peacefully protested the university's administration in the university administration's building. Police forcefully removed the students occupying the building, and then, of course, the situation escalated, wherein there were 97 arrests and over $2 million in damages. Now, this is 1969, $2 million in 1969. This was seen as, and is still seen today, as the largest student riot in Canadian history. The picture to the upper right hand of the screen is a picture of Africville, Halifax, Nova Scotia, 1970, where the city of Halifax refused to provide any basic amenities to the predominantly Black community that lived there. In 1964, the city voted to demolish Africville, and they relocated the community without the community's consultation. The last home was destroyed in January 1970. the picture to the bottom right speaks to what was known as the West Indian Domestic Scheme. During the 1920s, a number of West Indian women were informally permitted into Canada as domestics or servants to work for rich white Canadians. It was in 1955, however, that a formal policy was developed to recruit annually 100 black women from Barbados and Jamaica who were between the ages of 18 and 35 and in good health, with minimum of grade 8 education, to work as servants for at least 1 year. The inducement was that they would be eligible for Canadian citizenship in 5 years. Canada was prepared to tolerate a minuscule number of black women coming into the country, provided that they were doing work suited to their race. Let's have some reflection time here. I want you to think about the predominant messages about black people and their potential contribution to Canadian society through this historic lens. The next slide speaks to data from Statistics Canada 2016 report on the black population. And there are close to 1.2 million people in Canada who report being black. And the black population now accounts for about 3.5% of Canada's total population. And according to population projections from Statistics Canada, the black population will continue to increase and could represent 5% of Canada's population by 2036. Now, despite what I would say is optimistic growth, a 2019 report has stated that about 50% of black people in a survey reported that their race was an obstacle to their success, compared to only 6% of white people. So there is an issue with black people feeling like, all things equal, their race is detrimental to their existence. It's a detrimental characteristic. So the experience of black people in Canada does not align much with the positive marketing of diversity in Canadian society. Here's the thing. It's great to have diversity. And increasing diversity without increasing equity and inclusion is a recipe for failure. The image that you see on this slide depicts a diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging model endorsed by diversity experts like John Powell and others. And he stated that we need to get beyond diversity and get to a place where society and organizations have inclusive cultures. Diversity experts endorse a three-way Venn diagram representing the intersections of diversity, equity, and inclusion. In the middle, where the three meet, is what has become known as belonging. Now, there is a CEO by the name of Jeff Hutchinson who has said that diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging are complex terms to understand. And they are complex, because people are always talking about how the concepts are interrelated, but exactly how do you explain their interconnectedness? Well, he has suggested a party analogy to explain the relationship between these various concepts. So here we go. We're going to a party, or I'm going to invite you to a party. All right, here we go. Diversity is like being invited to a party. We only invite people to our home that we see as worthy and similar to us. So this party is about having people who are different than you. Okay, so you're having a party with people who are different from you. All right. Equity is having an accessibility ramp to your door. Because not everyone can walk up the steps and get to the door to the party. Having the resources available to allow people with different abilities to get into the party is equity. So, all right. All right, so we invited people to the party. We got to think about how they're going to get to the party and into the door. Inclusion, now don't forget they're in the door. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Who doesn't want to be asked to dance at the party? Being offered refreshments, and crudité, like my mom used to say, and being asked to help clean up at the party. Now, there's a caveat. The people with the power control inclusiveness. They're the ones that usually do the asking, but not necessarily all the time. Belonging is deciding the music at the party, the decorations, and the food. Now, the best party is always the one you hate to leave. All right, this is my dancing. When I was younger, my moves were a lot more complex. Belonging is you're having such a great time at the party. It becomes your party. You're a part of sharing your talents, and you're not sitting around hoping to fit in. I love the party analogy. It shows exactly how the concepts of diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging are interrelated. Now, I have another perspective of looking at these concepts that I want to pass by you. I want to try. I argue that diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, though interrelated, represent a developmental stage wherein at each stage there are inherent tasks that represent challenges or opportunities that, once resolved, permits a society or an organization, an institution to go to the next phase. With the final goal always being the creation of a sense of belonging of its members. So this slide shows diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging as a sequential developmental framework, with each phase containing developmental tasks that, if successfully negotiated, can progressively lead to a sense of belonging. Let me describe the framework from a theoretical stance. We'll forgo the party metaphor. Diversity is about having a spectrum of human difference. It's about representation. It's about numbers and representation of a group within a larger group. Right? So in terms of racial diversity, the question we can ask is there a spectrum of human racial difference? The task at hand that must be resolved is the question of representation across the organization. Representation in the executive suite, leadership. Once that is resolved, then we need to pay attention to equity. Equity refers to the equal opportunity for all humans. The essential question to ask here is whether everyone is provided with an opportunity to access the resources that permit them to participate or to be successful in a given context without bias, harassment, or discrimination. The fundamental task here is for leaders to identify and dismantle inequitable processes and practices. Once people feel like the playing field is level, then they will understand that they can participate and/or that the opportunity is there in which to participate. Once participation is granted or attained, we then must turn our attention to inclusion. Inclusion refers to behaviors. You heard me. Inclusion is about behaviors. Behaviors that demonstrate an intentional and continuous process to address inequality in power and privilege, and builds a respectful and diverse community that includes different perspectives and ideas. The task at this level is to not be afraid of having conversations about intentional and unintentional microaggressions, being able to give space to courageous conversations, and engaging in practicing inclusive leadership. Once we help people to feel included, then we hope to create a sense of belonging. And belonging in this model, belonging is the ultimate goal. It's a feeling. It's a feeling or a state of psychological safety at work or in society. It's the ability of bringing your authentic self to work and feeling valued and respected for who you are. Oh, load off your shoulders. The task under sense of belonging suggests that we start to look at predominant paradigms or ways of doing things, ways of being within our society or organizations. And we start to question them openly with each other. I mean, ultimately, it's about shifting dominant paradigms and decentering them. So the rest of the presentation will be built around these 4 developmental principles as they relate to anti-Black racism specifically, kind of like an attempt to apply the model to anti-Black racism. So let's look at diversity. The first stage, which is primarily about representation. Let's think here in a broader societal, term. In terms of the first task with respect to anti-Black racism, the only question that needs to be asked is, are Black people represented across the various societal professions and industries? That's the only question you need to ask. Well, the statistics tell us that Black Canadians suffer higher unemployment and lower wages. And this gap was heightened by the pandemic. One of the trends that we see throughout most of the articles and studies on Black employment seem to show the distribution of Black labor concentrated in low-paying jobs. The accompanying trend is that as the prestige and salary expectation increase, you see fewer and fewer Black people. As a result, Black people are underrepresented in almost every professional category in healthcare, business, technology, science, academia. And sometimes, even when they are in the better paying jobs, they're still paid lower than non-racialized individuals. So for example, there was an article that talked about Blacks were about 2.6% of the Canadian tech workforce. And they were at the lowest scales within that workforce. So representation is a pervasive problem in many industries and professions. There needs to be a strategy to start to amplify the presence of Black people in a variety of industries. Now, let's try to make a connection backwards. The interesting observation is that given the history of Black employment in Canada, what we are seeing is resulting in or seems to recreate or mirror the perception that Black individuals are better suited for particular kind of jobs. And they're overrepresented in particular kind of jobs. How is that not occupational segregation? The second task under diversity pertains to representation in leadership. Is the leadership diverse? Is there Black leadership? In an article written by Jeffries et al. About nursing leadership, it was stated that Black nurses were overrepresented in entry-level and non-specialty areas, such as care assistants, and underrepresented in specialty and advanced practice and upper-level management roles, such as intensive care units, etc. The authors put forward that as healthcare diversifies, Black leadership might be important to help address unique and diverse needs for racialized communities and developing different approaches to leadership. So there is an advantage to Black leadership. Unfortunately, Blacks continue to be underrepresented and sometimes non-existent in leadership positions and on boards in major cities across Canada. And this lack of representation needs to be addressed. Here's Professor Charmaine Williams from the School of Graduate Studies at the University of Toronto, where she is in a leadership position as Vice Dean for students. Listen to how she frames her experience as a Black leader and what Black leadership means to her.
Good morning. I am the granddaughter of Sadie on my mother's side and Priscilla on my father's side. They were both born in Jamaica and were the descendants of slaves. They did not have the opportunity for anything more than the most basic of education. I am the daughter of Peter and Gloria, who were also born in Jamaica. I recently listened as my father told my 14-year-old son that he started working in the fields when he was a boy, because if he didn't work, he didn't eat. My mother got a little further with her education. She completed high school. They both traveled to England when they were young adults, like many others. And there they met, they married, they started a family, and they took that family to Canada because they saw limited futures for their daughters in England and hoped for better futures here. They were determined that their children would get good educations. I am the first person in my family to attend university. My sister, my brother, and I are still the only ones that have attended university. This is despite the fact that I have dozens of cousins. My father was one of 13 siblings, so I literally have dozens of cousins. They are in England, and they were all eligible for university during a period when British students did not need to pay tuition. And yet, somehow, none of them were streamed into the pathways that would have made that possible. I was the only Black person in my undergraduate programs at McMaster. I was the only Black person in my master's program at the University of Toronto. I was not the only Black person in my doctoral program at U of T, and it was in that doctoral program that I had my very first Black instructor. And this is after having completed grade school, high school, 2 undergraduate degrees and a master's degree in this country. I was the only Black professor in my faculty for 15 years, the 3rd Black professor since its establishment in 1914. Happily, I'm no longer the only one. So how does that accounting of my history and my family's history lead into the answer to a question about where are all the Black people in the academy? And more specifically, how does it contribute to a conversation about why don't we have more Black people in academic leadership? Because I'll be focusing on academic leadership because that's where I exist, although I expect we will be talking about various types of leadership during our time together today. I believe that one of the reasons we don't see more Black people in academic leadership is because many Black people do not have the personal and institutional legacies that position people to be in leadership. We may enter the academic space without histories of being in such spaces, without experiences that equip us to navigate the space, without allies that would mentor us in this space, and without people placed in academic institutions that even represent the possibility that we could occupy leadership positions in the space. There are others who enter the university with all of these things in place. They use that legacy and the tacit knowledge that comes along with it to chart the path toward leadership. They enter assuming it is a possibility for them, an option they can exercise. And the institution mirrors this back to them, recognizing them as people who fit. They get tapped on the shoulder to lead. This is not true for us. This is not true for many. So a partial answer to a question of how we could begin to see more Black people in academic leadership is that we would need to reveal that there is in fact a path to leadership, and that some people are on the express route to that path. And that express route needs to be made visible and available to other people. The mentors, the guides, the key opportunities that remain hidden from so many of us need to be shared, or there needs to be institutional will to create different pathways that do not rely on having a specific type of legacy. And a basic contribution towards building those pathways for Black people is building and sustaining a critical mass of students, staff, and faculty members that help create the environmental conditions for Black peoples to become leaders in academic institutions. We hold that possibility of building a critical mass together with the knowledge that building that critical mass can be very lonely work. Being the first, the only, the underrepresented is lonely, hard work. But loneliness isn't all that is part of that experience of what it means to be the first, the only, or the underrepresented. It can also be about feeling alienated in these academic spaces because people don't expect you to be here. They don't anticipate that you'll be here. They don't include you when you're here. And sometimes they may be very direct in communicating that they don't want you to be here because it disrupts a status quo that from their perspective has been working just fine. Academic systems are incredibly resistant to change. I am often impressed by how universities have managed to resist change. We often hear the metaphor of universities being like big ships that are hard to steer in a new direction, but universities are people. And what we are really saying is that people in universities are hard to turn, hard to shift in a new direction. They think there is no reason for things to change. It's working just fine. It's worked fine for hundreds of years. They assert the importance of their traditions and their legacies. And when you are in that space as the first, the only, the underrepresented, you represent change. Change that will require them to do things differently. Change that will require them to move out of their comfort zones. Change that requires them to be open to things that will challenge them. Change that requires them to be decentered in the space and to share the space. And as that first, only, or underrepresented person, you come to represent and symbolize the change that people find strange or scary or hostile. And they may treat you as if you are strange, scary, or hostile. And we know that Black students, staff, and faculty members walk into universities every day and they brace themselves for the experiences that will remind them that they are viewed as strange or scary or hostile or disruptive, or the list goes on, all the ways in which the change we represent is not welcomed, is rejected, is ejected. Representing that change and bearing all that comes with it takes a toll. It can be a lonely place to be. It can be a very tense place to be. It can be a scary place to be. This is why I often talk about the importance of finding what we need to sustain ourselves in academic spaces. It's important to find the people that sustain you, find the work that sustains you, find the goals that sustain you. And because we are talking about leadership today, it is important for you to lead things you care about because that will also sustain you. Because being the first, the only, the underrepresented is really hard work. It's draining work. It's you 100% on, radar up, armor in place, thickening your skin, not making any mistakes because you can't make any mistakes, ready for what's coming because it's coming. It's all of that. And before we can even talk about being part of leadership in the academy, we need to talk about how we survive in the academy. But I don't want you to think that my story or the story of Black people in the university is only a story about marginalization and alienation. I believe universities are wonderful places. They're a place for learning and growth and transformation and freedom. People who are in universities and who come through universities can change the world and make it a better place. I still remember the very first day I stepped on a university campus for my first day at McMaster. And I looked around me and I saw possibility, endless possibility. And there have been some tough times, but I still believe universities are a space of possibility, and I want that for more people. And so we are here now, underrepresented, but we are here now. And in a moment, when I believe we can talk about what we are going to do now that we are here and now. So let's start talking about why we need more Black people in leadership in the academy. Let's talk about why universities need more Black people in positions of leadership, and why I am asking Black people and others to see themselves taking leadership in the academy. We need more Black people in leadership because representation matters. It's that simple. We need Black people in places that represent the possibility that leadership is not reserved for people who are legacies, that others can be in positions of responsibility and authority in our universities. Our presence in leadership represents the possibilities for others who have not seen themselves represented. We represent the possibility that they matter, that they have a role to play, that they can be leaders in this space and leaders in other spaces. I ask more Black people to see themselves in leadership because we need to represent the possibility of more people being able to take up leadership in universities and outside of universities. We need more Black people in leadership because we need new ways of leading. I know that sometimes people are turned off from taking leadership roles because they aren't interested in having power over other people. We recoil from taking on leadership in the ways we have seen it taken up by others. I know that I myself have recoiled from that, and honestly, I don't think I have ever stepped forward and said I'm looking for a leadership position. But what I have come to understand is that there is nothing that says we need to lead in the ways we have seen others lead. We do not need to use authority or position or power in ways that we have seen it used over us and against us. We can define a different type of leadership. Leadership that is based in things like service, commitment, responsiveness, caring, social justice. I ask more Black people to see themselves taking leadership because I believe that we need to define new ways of leading universities.
Good morning and good afternoon to all.
So this ends our conversation about the developmental phase of diversity. Let's move to equity. Remember that generally equity is about equal opportunity. The developmental task in equity is to ensure that leaders understand what inequity is and what it looks like. It's well known that if leaders cannot recognize a problem, then it will not be solved, no matter what industry you're in. So whether it's a political issue where political leaders have to understand how to generate more equitable participation in life for Black, or Indigenous people, or whether it's an organizational level issue where leaders understand some of the barriers for attracting and retaining Black talent once they're in the organization. We need leaders to be aware of equity issues. Now, leaders, let's see if I could get this. There you go, thank you. Leaders absolutely need to understand inequitable practices within organizations, given that 3 in 5 Black Canadians see racism as a problem in their workplaces, as reported by Human Resources Canada statistics. So on the slide are examples which demonstrate the consequences of what happens when leaders did not seem to understand or were not interested in understanding inequitable practices within their organizations. The first example is York Region's Children's Aid Society in Ontario, where issues of racism and anti-Black racism were allowed and enabled by leadership. In an independent report, it was reported that Black female staff members were being told that their look, so their hair, dress, even body shape, was inappropriate for the workplace. While some South Asian staff reported that they needed to learn English properly. These perceptions would definitely have an inequitable impact on career progression. The other is the ex-CEO who oversaw the Quebec hospital, where the Indigenous patient was mocked and insulted before she died. Even though he had received about 10 formal complaints about the care provided to the Atikamekw residents, he was unaware of the racist problem. The consequences for these two organizations were dire in terms of psychological trauma of staff, interruption of service for clients, death of a client, client complaints, reputational risk, which is any leader's worst nightmare. Their stories ending up in the newspaper. Now, the sad part is that it's usually after an organization's reputation is on the line and they're accused of inequitable practices against racialized individuals is when leaders decide, everyone needs diversity and equity training. When diversity and equity is in response to an organizational crisis, or when you frame it as a mandatory initiative because of legal requirements, that is probably the worst way to introduce diversity and equity to leaders. On the right side of the screen, you see two articles about diversity training for leaders. And the articles state that there's evidence to show that organizations with leaders who espouse the importance of equity, fairness, inclusivity, and diversity enjoy better culture within their organization. Yet, diversity and inclusion training is often enlisted to help reform middle management, even though the company's tone is established from senior leadership. A lot of diversity training happens at the front line, middle management, and nothing happens where all the decisions are made. It's also important to note that the article that speaks about the problem with diversity training, they said that there's some evidence to support that leaders may resent diversity training because they resist any effort to control how and what they're supposed to think. Interesting. Nevertheless, change starts at the top of the organization. I have an interesting example that demonstrates why leaders need to understand equity. I'm going to set it up for you. So this is a video of a popular Quebec TV show, and the Minister of Indigenous Affairs is there to talk about how Quebec plans to beat racism. The only problem is that everyone else on the panel understands racism to be a systemic problem in Canada, except for the Minister of Indigenous Affairs in Quebec. So it's in French. So I'm going to do a small translation first, and then I'll play it for you so you understand what's happening. So Let me get my script. So the minister says, what we want to do is to attack racism and deal with racist people, because the rest of it is a semantic debate referring to the concept of systemic racism. The host looks at the minister, and the host shows that he's somewhat, exasperated by the minister's comment, his statement. And the host goes, but Mr. Minister, you cannot change racist people's minds or attitudes by going into their basements and talking to them while they work on their computer keyboards. The only racism that you have the power to do anything about is racism in the system. The minister replies, with the definition of systemic racism that you just used, you're implying that the system created racism and that there aren't racist people. The host says it's not that it was the system that created racism, it's that historically racism has been embedded in everything, everywhere, therefore also in the processes and functions of the system. The best we can do is to identify racism in the system first, in a way that it is no longer in the education system, is no longer in the healthcare system. They are called systems. We say that systems are failing Indigenous racialized people in health. We say that we are failing racialized Indigenous people in education. And we're going to have the audacity to say that racism is not in the system? This is a play on words for absolutely nothing. Our friends here, and he points to the two Indigenous guests, all they want us to say is, we see your pain. We recognize and acknowledge what happened. He then points to himself and says, it's not me who did it. I know it wasn't me. I wasn't there. I didn't take the children. I didn't bring them to the school. I didn't take them personally to those schools. But bloody hell, it's true and real. The racism that they're experiencing from the system. So the video is in French. I want you to watch the body language in the video. Watch the authentic and intense exchange.
On dit, nous autres, présentement, là, ce qu'on veut faire, c'est s'attaquer au racisme, s'attaquer aux gens qui sont racistes, parce que le reste, on passe sur un débat de sémantique et on n'avance pas.
Mais, Monsieur le ministre, vous ne pouvez pas changer les racistes dans leur sous-sol, derrière leur clavier. Le seul racisme auquel vous avez le pouvoir de vous attaquer, c'est celui du système.
Mais avec la définition de racisme systémique, on vient dire que c'est le système qui a créé ça, puis les gens le sont pas eux-mêmes.
C'est pas que c'est le système qui l'a créé, c'est que historiquement, il s'est encastré partout, dont dans le système. Le mieux qu'on puisse faire, c'est l'enlever de tout ça en premier. C'est de s'assurer qu'il n'est plus dans le système de santé, qu'il n'est plus dans le système d'éducation. Ça s'appelle des systèmes. On le dit que c'est défaillant en santé, on le dit que c'est défaillant en éducation, puis on va dire que c'est pas dans le système. C'est jouer sur les mots pour rien, alors que nos amis ici ont juste envie qu'on leur dise « Je reconnais ce qui s'est passé. » C'est pas moi qui l'ai fait. Je le sais que c'est pas moi. J'étais pas là. J'ai pas pris des enfants, je les ai pas amenés, moi, personnellement, dans ces écoles-là. Mais si bol, c'est vrai ce qu'ils vivent.
Si j'avais cette position...
So you see what happens when leadership doesn't understand about racism, diversity, or equity. The only thing I would say is that the host, though he claims he wasn't there during the historical social injustices towards Indigenous people, he could have gone one step further to think about how those injustices benefited him. That's my thoughts. Kind of next slide. There you go, thanks. The second task or challenge under equity would be to identify and dismantle inequitable practices and processes. Now, as we have this conversation with equity, we need to remember that it will focus on outcomes and on intentions. That is, it is possible for racial discrimination to be unintentional. And if one group is treated less favorably than another, then that is discrimination, whether it's intended or not. The Boston Consulting Group and the Civic Action Group of Canada came out with an amazing report on the pervasive reality of anti-Black racism in Canada in 2020 and 2021. And the aim of the report was to enable a better understanding of what Black people face and to illustrate the importance of action towards change. As we start to think about how to increase full participation of Black people in Canadian society, we need to dismantle inequitable practices and processes. So they focused on 4 specific areas where anti-Black racism is the most acutely felt: the education system, the employment sector, the justice system, and the healthcare system. Now, for the sake of time, I will only focus on employment and education. So let's start with employment. The report reiterates higher unemployment rates for Blacks than individuals who are not a visible minority, and that Blacks are disproportionately represented in service industry jobs. The report states that systemic biases make it more difficult for Black candidates to land positions for which they're qualified. And they refer to a study conducted in Toronto that used the same resume and cover letter with only 2 differences: whether the applicant had a white-sounding or Black-sounding name, and whether the applicant referred to having a criminal record in the cover letter. The results showed that among those with no criminal record, the white resume received 3 times the number of callbacks as a Black name. When both candidates indicated a criminal record, the difference in callbacks jumped to 12 times more for white names. And perhaps most shockingly, the white applicants with a criminal record still got nearly twice as many calls back as the Black applicants with no criminal record. Interesting. The report goes on to say that when Black people do succeed in finding a job, they may face systemic racism and hit against a glass ceiling, meaning that it's very difficult for them to progress in their careers. They state that Black employees have low rates of sponsorship, so people who are there to kind of help them through, and find hidden barriers in the promotion process. So that path, I think that as Charmaine was talking about, it's not clear how you move up in the organization, how you move your career forward. Now, it's important just to make a quick note about employment equity programs by the government and other institutions. So the success of Canada's employment equity legislation has fallen a little short, even though we applaud the legislation. Following its implementation, organizations covered by the Act introduced employment equity statements. They introduced employment equity policies, but many of the statements failed because there was no action. And in many instances, employment equity statements were offered up. The statements was the work that was offered up for evidence that change had already taken place and in effect, reinforcing and reproducing the status quo. And researchers have seen that employment equity policies tend to increase representation selectively. The representation of white women have increased at a faster pace than the representation of visible minorities. Let's talk about education. Now, they say education is supposed to be the great equalizer. The report states that Black students face assessment bias from students They receive 2 times fewer excellent ratings by teachers, but despite receiving the same standardized scores on tests. Black students are disproportionately suspended and expelled. They make up 42% and 48% of these categories respectively, but only make up 12% of the student population. Fewer Black students feel a sense of trust and belonging in school. And Black students enter school at a disadvantage due to socioeconomic conditions, right? So they're twice as likely as white students to come from a low-income household, and that obviously is tied to broader socio-political economic situations for Black parents. These are statistics. These are the numbers. What we see in these statistics is compounded historical interest in sadness, devaluation, and pain. And these statistics are not acontextual. Some of you social workers have heard from these children. Each one of these statistics has a story. A child or an adolescent has an experience about being suspended, expelled, feeling devalued by teachers and others in the system. In a report that was entitled Race, Equity, and Education, there was a social worker's quote that I thought, oh man, it's so powerful. And the social worker said, as a social worker, during student success meetings, I'm infuriated at how often the guidance counselor suggested changing pathways for Black and visible minority students whenever they were not receiving a passing grade. And they went on to say that this was not suggested as often for white students. And they said over and over again, they noticed how white students' poor grades were explained away based on things like mental health, family circumstances, and other concerns. And the assumption is that their grades will improve and there'll be no need, for them to move down to the applied level. However, Black students who struggle must be placed in the proper track for their academic potential. So inequity for Black people is pervasive. Until we deal with inequity, there is no way Black people will feel like they have a chance to participate in their lives. Once people feel like the playing field is level, then they understand that they can participate and be heard. This takes us to the developmental stage of inclusion. Remember that inclusion is described as behaviors that allow people to be respected for who they are. In this phase, Black people shouldn't have to contend with microaggressions. And if they do occur, there's an open, an honest, an openness and willingness to have a discussion about the issues without retribution. I just want to clarify 2 important terms before we get into the first task under inclusion. Many of you may know this or not, but in order to fit in, many Black people report engaging in what is called code switching or covering. Code switching refers to someone adjusting their style of speech, their appearance, their behavior, and their expression in a way that makes others feel more comfortable with them in exchange for fair treatment or employment opportunities. Black people are taught at an early age how to code switch, sometimes in order to survive interactions with police, interactions with their teachers. Covering is another form of survival for Black employees. Covering is a strategy through which an individual downplays a known stigmatized identity to blend into the mainstream. So, covering could fall into 4 kinds of categories. Appearances, so altering aspects of one's appearance, such as hairstyle. Sometimes even skin tone. We know that there's creams for that. Association, which is limiting interactions with others of the same identity. So all the Black people over there, I'm gonna go over here, because when Black people congregate, that can't be a good thing. affiliation, which means attempting to be different from stereotypes associated with one's identity group. Usually with black people, it's, I'm not going to get too angry because you don't want to be seen as the angry black woman or the angry black man who's going to be out of control. So you're very aware of those stereotypes, and you actually try to play against those stereotypes. And the last is advocacy, which is refraining from speaking up on behalf of one's identity group. So research suggests that 80% of blacks cover around appearance, grooming, and mannerisms. The first task of inclusion would be to reduce the need for covering. Any requests made to alter your appearance when not connected to health or safety is a microaggression. It's an assault to the self. This slide shows examples of news stories where black people were asked to alter their hair. And this happens more often than you think. The black student on your left was asked to leave the cheerleading squad at the University of Ottawa because her braids were said to be too long, hindering her performance. Now, I take it that the other picture is of a white cheerleader on the same team. Please make your observations. Do you see a difference? According to the author, Lawana Harris, while the topic of how a person chooses to wear their hair may seem trivial, it's actually not. Many black women have been told that their hair is not professional. Some have been told that, they'd have more opportunity if they straightened their hair, dressed less ethnic, and modified their communication style. These suggestions signal the pressure to assimilate to a dominant culture. The next video shows another example of how black hair could be a barrier to inclusion.
This is how they want me to change. I understand for other people it is easier, and because I take pride in my natural hair. I took it out for her in the office so she can see that it doesn't really go down. She understood that from my understanding, but it was still it was almost embarrassing as well because other coworkers also saw me and were like, oh, you're done for the day. And then I was like, no, I can't come back if this is how they want me to change. I understand for other people it is easier, and for me it would be easier, but I'm just saying the times where I don't wear my extensions, it should just be okay that I want to wear how my God gave me my hair,
The next task requires inclusive leadership. Leaders need to create a safe team environment where all employees can speak up, be heard, and feel welcome. They should embrace the input of employees whose backgrounds and expertise differ from their own, facilitate constructive arguments, and act upon the advice of diverse employees. Inclusive leadership values authenticity over conformity and operating from an understanding that a range of presentation and communication styles can succeed in various contexts. This slide depicts news stories that speak to inclusive leadership involving black people. So the first story is about a retired judge, black judge, that was detained and handcuffed by Vancouver police on May 14th. They mistook the judge for an assault suspect, described as dark-skinned, 40 to 50 years old. This judge is 81 and was the first black judge appointed to the BC Supreme Court. They stopped him. He was on a walk. They stopped him, put him in handcuffs, even after he told them that he was a retired Supreme Court judge. The police commissioner apologized, referred the case to the police board for further investigation. I mean, there's a lot to deconstruct in that story, but we don't got time for that. For me, a society or an organization practices inclusive leadership if it is able to respond to the pain and injustices of its members and seeks to learn and correct it. That's inclusive leadership. The next story is about a policewoman on the Toronto Police Force who alleges that she was subjected to years of intimidation and reprisals by fellow officers and supervisors after she intervened to stop what she said was the unjustified use of force during the arrest of a black suspect. After reporting her fellow officer, she said that she was passed over for promotions. She was left vulnerable to prolonged racist and sexist attacks from colleagues. They called her a rat. This is a story to remind us that inclusive leadership is open to changing the status quo, not keeping up the status quo. The last picture to your left represents two articles about gaslighting. Gaslighting is defined as the effort of one person to undermine another person's confidence and stability by causing the victim to doubt their own senses and beliefs. An article that speaks about psychological gaslighting within the Hamilton, Ontario Police Service addressed the issue of carding and street checks. Now, though carding was becoming more and more of a contentious issue in the province of Ontario between 2015 and 2016, and I think they've stopped the practice, at that time, the police service of Hamilton drew criticism in their denial that carding was similar to street checks. They defined street checks as building relationships with community members through randomly approaching people on the street, irrespective of race. Carding, what was practiced in Toronto, was an intelligence gathering policy of the Toronto Police Service involving the stopping, questioning, and documenting of individuals when no particular offense was being investigated. Okay. This is just an example to show that inclusive leadership does not further alienate and disenfranchise members of a community by undermining and hiding the truth of the reality of the community. It's important for leaders in organizations to talk about the unspeakable, even before it rises its head. The Canadian Centre for Diversity and Inclusion has stated that very little is written about reverse racism in Canada. However, there is an increasing belief that it's gaining some traction in Canadian workplaces. Reverse discrimination is the belief that minorities are being given preferential treatment, even though study after study after study after study finds that employment discrimination is still against people of color. It also addresses the receptivity of white people to entertain notions around diversity, equity, and inclusion. There was an interesting study that was done to determine the impact of a company's pro-diversity messaging on the hiring process. Researchers created a hiring simulation in which half of the participants were offered recruiting materials that stated the fictitious company's pro-diversity position, while the other half received materials that did not mention anything about diversity. The study found that white men who read the pro-diversity statements showed more cardiovascular stress and performed worse than those who had not. And these responses appeared across the board for this demographic, regardless of political opinions, attitudes, beliefs about diversity and minority groups. The authors suggest that there may be a subconscious resistance to diversity among those who have traditionally held positions of power. Because even when they agree with and believe in diversity and equity practices, they still had the same cardiovascular stress and response. Interesting. This brings me to another point. I think an inclusive leader, and as an inclusive leader, we need to ensure that white people also have a safe space to own their truths and whatever resistance might come up for them. Why? Because we are all to be included in what we call inclusion. We may all have a different vantage point, but the path to belonging involves getting comfortable with the uncomfortable. Belonging is the last phase, and remember, it is a feeling. It's a feeling that permits you to bring your authentic self to work. In order to bring your authentic self to work, that would mean no more code switching, no more covering, which means that we would have moved the bar away from the predominant culture. The idea here is that at this point, we should be reshaping culture. Culture speaks to new ways of being and new ways of doing. As an inclusive culture should be, when we start to think about belonging, culture takes a long time to develop. But culture should still be the result of all the work that preceded this phase of belonging. Now, from a societal and organizational perspective, we all know that Canada is presently centered around white privilege. Now, white privilege may be it's a big term. It's a term that is uncomfortable for some white people because they would say, and they've told me, Keith, I've worked hard for everything that I have. What do you mean white privilege? I don't have white privilege. Let me be clear. Recognizing white privilege does not mean suffering guilt or shame for your lot in life. Nobody's saying that straight, white, middle-class, able-bodied men and women are horrible people who don't work hard for what they have. Recognizing privilege simply means that being aware that some people must work much harder just to experience the same things some white people take for granted, if they can ever experience the same thing as white people at all. So the whole idea of white privilege basically implies that systems, institutions, organizations, laws are created in a way that lifts up those who are white, but overtly and subtly frustrates the equal access to resources that permit optimal participation in life for Black people. That's all it means. And a perfect example of this is demonstrated in a study that was done in Australia that attempted to prove white privilege was real. And so that's the article that you see right in front of you where it says, white privilege is real, and now there's research to prove it. Finally! It wasn't in your mind, Keith, it's real. Here's what these researchers did. The researchers tasked 29 adult riders of white, Asian, Indian, and Black descent to board buses with an empty transit card and see whether or not drivers will let them ride for free. Participants were told to say that they didn't have any money, but that they needed to get to X station. After analyzing more than 1,500 interactions, what the researchers found was astounding. Asians and whites were able to ride for free at nearly identical rates, 72%. But bus drivers often declined the request of Indian and black passengers. 51% of free ride requests from Indian riders were honored, while requests from black riders were twice as likely as those from whites and Asians to be turned down, with only 36% being able to board the bus and ride without paying. Okay, let's compare this to real life. So for the 64% of black riders who were not allowed to board the bus, they would have probably had to walk, meaning it would have taken them a lot longer to get to the destination compared to all the other passengers who got on the bus. Think about how that long walk impacts on their life outcomes and their ability to participate in life. The picture to the right of the screen is a picture of Hadia Roderick, who wrote an article about her experiences navigating the legal spaces of Bay Street law firms as a black woman. And she talks about the fact that in law school, she had to pass a social belonging test, which basically decided whether she would have what it took to belong to what she called in the article, what she called an upper white class world. And if I had more time, I'd read what she said because it's an amazing article. So, in our reflections around whiteness and what it means, we have to be aware of how it contributes to structural racism. Here's a clip about a news story where a hospital put out a job ad for a white woman-only position.
We talk so much about these guardian angels, many of whom are black, who basically put their lives on the line to serve, to help people in hospitals. And then we have the situation. It's deplorable. It's unacceptable.
A hospital north of Montreal in Saint-Eustache posted 10 job offers looking for white-only female orderlies back in November. La Presse obtained emails showing the ads, the hospital saying it was to work with a difficult patient who allegedly requested a white woman.
And it's absolutely appalling, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that the administrative machine considered it to be acceptable and acted like this was a viable demand, something that is compatible with their values.
The hospital emails read, only accepts women of white skin color. Another specified that the orderly must have white skin, and another requesting white woman only. The regional health authority in the Laurentians, responsible for the Saint-Eustache Hospital, tells City News it's launched an investigation and say they are stunned, adding that the patient who made the request for a white woman only suffers from cognitive impairments who became disoriented while receiving care from a person of color. In a statement, spokesperson Julie Lemieux-Côté writes, the situation is totally unacceptable and goes completely against the instructions of openness and respect that we have transmitted on several occasions to all our teams. Any recruitment or hiring situation goes through a process that is fairly accessible to all.
How many postings in the province of Quebec don't have that same characteristic? But in the minds of the people who are deciding who they're going to hire, they do have that bias.
It's not everyone who are going to come out and share their stories and kind of share their experiences and for it to be validated. We still have an issue, and we still have an obstacle where their supervisors may not only decide to believe it, but also not validated.
This comes days after an Indigenous woman says hospital staff in Joliette, northeast of Montreal, wanted to call her Joyce instead of using her actual name after Joyce Echaquan, the 37-year-old Atikamekw woman who died in September, live streaming as racist slurs were hurled at her from hospital staff. Quebec's Deputy Premier and Public Security Minister Geneviève Guilbeault says this new incident is unacceptable and that the province plans to improve training in the healthcare network.
We want to make sure that every employee in the healthcare system is aware of the necessity to make sure that all citizens in our nation of Quebec are equally treated and have the same right to receive the same services.
We need to make sure that we can eradicate this kind of race-based preferences in hospital and healthcare services. But more importantly, have to ensure that it will not happen again.
In Montreal, Melina Jubilaro, City News.
We talk so much about these guardian angels.
Is it done? Okay. So the second task under belonging is about shifting paradigms and cultures. These two articles speak to how we can shift from a predominant paradigm that focuses on whiteness and entertain other paradigms. This approach is couched in Indigenous knowledge, but also in Ghanaian knowledge. The idea here is that we all need each other, and we must engage in a co-learning journey. Two-eyed seeing is the ability to be familiar with more than one knowledge system and being able to work through issues by bringing knowledges together. George Day suggests that if colonization is understood as an imposition of one particular way of doing things, when we open the space for multiple ways of knowing and understanding and being, we begin to undo the colonial knowledge regimes. He continues further to say that in an effort to decolonize, we must remember that the work is not to undo Western ways of knowing, but rather to undo the hold they have on what is considered legitimate knowledge and ways of being. In other words, the work of decolonization is not about, placing another form of knowledge at the top of the knowledge pyramid, but rather finding ways of multiple knowledges of dialogue for anti-colonial practice. So there's a centrality around whiteness. Right now, whiteness is the predominant paradigm within Canadian society. The closer you are to whiteness in terms of looks, attitudes, values, anything that supports ways of doing and being that are connected to whiteness, the higher your probability of success in life and participation in life. What we want to move to is decentering of whiteness, but not getting rid of whiteness, because whiteness is also part of our diversity. So we need to understand our societal and organizational cultures. But like I said before, shifting culture is not easy. My ability to do that and your ability to create a culture that allows me to do that in terms of shifting culture, us working together, is what really will help us move towards stronger belonging. In closing, I would like to show you a video that speaks to the power of whiteness and how early children pick up on the notion that white is good and black is bad. They say that from the mouth of babes comes the truth. Well, what does this video say about the predominant narratives in our world today and the fight for racial equality?
Quale bambola è bianca? Quale bambola è nera? Quale delle due è bella?
Questa.
Qual è quella bella? Qual è quella brutta? E qual è quella buona? Quale è cattiva? Qual è buona?
Lei.
Perché è buona?
Perché ha gli occhi celesti.
Quale è cattiva? Perché è cattiva?
Perché è tutto nero.
E qual è la bambola che ti somiglia di più? Quale bambola è nera?
Mi ha offeso. Tu. Perché mi hai chiamato nero?
Perché ti offendo?
Mi offendo perché altri bambini mi hanno offeso con cattiveria.
No.
Have you seen
non ho usato nessuna cattiveria.
Quello mi sta guardando storto.
So thank you for listening today. I know we went a bit over time. Thank you for your indulgence.
Thank you, Keith. So we're going to now move on to ask a few questions. I think we only have time for a few today, so I appreciate everybody's positive comments in the chat feature. So the first question that I'll ask, how inclusive is Canada to people with disabilities? Do Black people with disabilities face extra exclusion?
Thank you for that question. It's an excellent question. People with disabilities face a tremendous amount of obstacles to employment, education, and so when you add that to race, and you take an intersectional perspective of two marginalized identities, there is absolutely issues of inequity to the job market, to education. A lot of the same barriers that Black people face as well. And so, you know, there needs to be strategies for the inclusion as well of people with disabilities in any kind of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiative across Canada. And we know that people with disabilities have a very long history as well in Canada and the United States with advocacy and moving things forward for themselves. I think what we want to see is a Canada where we don't have to always be the ones. So the victims do not always have to be the ones trying to move things forward for themselves. And hopefully through a broader awareness around equity and inclusion, diversity and belonging initiatives, people with disabilities, people of color will find more allies, perhaps even work together to move forward on issues of social justice for anyone who's marginalized. So thank you for that question.
Thank you, Keith. And we'll ask one final question from Numa. Where is the line between people feeling discriminated against and that discrimination being real? Sometimes we get kind of preconditioned by the discrimination discourse to an extent where we attribute everything that doesn't go the way we like to discrimination, noting that internalized discrimination comes so easy when that is what someone has always felt in their lives and throughout generations.
Wow. That's a really good question. I think there is a school of thought that says that people who experience racism, people who experience constant microaggressions, actually go through what they call racial trauma. And some people equate racial trauma to, a kind of PTSD, right? Where it becomes difficult for you you're in a state of hypervigilance and you're in a state of needing to protect yourself. So sometimes when you experience particular circumstances that may trigger moments of another issue where you did actually experience racism, you may have hypervigilance. I think the important work to do is to recognize the devaluation, recognize the rage that racism causes, recognize sometimes the voicelessness that you have in particular situations, recognize the impact that racism has had. So it's hard to tell someone, well, when it's not happening, you're not supposed to react, because what happens is racism sometimes it's so subtle, it's just a feeling. And, my guess is that I would always tell people, talk to someone about it, deconstruct it, try to understand it, try to understand your role in it without negating it, because it still comes from something that's real. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Keith. I'll invite Council President Mukesh to the podium now.
As Keith said, wow. Thank you very much, Keith, for providing us with such an insightful presentation. It was very powerful. Keith, thanks again for reflecting on the terrorist act that occurred in my hometown. It continues to pain me, and I'm sure so many people, not only in Canada, but around the world. I know we will all have a responsibility to continue to reflect critically upon our assumptions and give space for dialogue on these challenging and important issues. On behalf of the college, thank you again for your keynote address. In lieu of a speaker's gift, the college has made a donation to Yorktown Family Services, a not-for-profit community resource which supports and equips women, children, youth, and families to create positive change in their lives. Again, Keith, I thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.